In April of 1989, Reverend Dwight Moore and his new wife Blanche were driving home to North Carolina after their honeymoon. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they were happy to be making a fresh start.
It gave us a break.
All was wedded bliss. Until on the Cape May Lewis ferry, Reverend Moore fell gravely ill. Blanche drove her husband home to Winston-Salem, determined to nurse him back to health.
Hello, sweetheart.
She was a fine cook and thought that some of her good food would do the trick.
Oh my gosh.
Despite her care, her new husband's condition grew worse. Finally, he was rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe abdominal cramps. His doctor believed he had come down with an intestinal flu. But the Reverend told him his symptoms began shortly after he'd cleaned his garage of old household chemicals. He believed that something there had made him ill. Or perhaps it was the chemicals he'd recently sprayed on his lawn. Doctors performed a series of tests to determine what he may have been exposed to. The results revealed a shocking level of arsenic. Because arsenic poisoning is uncommon, North Carolina's chief medical examiner, John Butts, was called to investigate where the toxin may have come from. He didn't believe it could have entered Reverend Moore's system from cleaning his garage.
Arsenic is used in some fungicides, insecticides, and so there are possibilities for unintentional or accidental poisonings, but they're quite rare.
Arsenic is a highly toxic metallic element. Everyone has traces of it in their body, but Reverend Moore demonstrated an almost superhuman tolerance to it. He consumed enough to kill 10 men. It would be almost impossible to accidentally ingest that much of the poison.
There are certain medications that do contain arsenic. They're usually mainly in veterinary medicine against certain kinds of parasites, but there are very, very few medications, almost no medications that would be used in this country for humans that would contain arsenic.
His family gathered at his bedside, not sure if the Reverend would survive one of the highest levels of arsenic poisoning on record.
He told me he was fine.
He was. I brought a little sample to my husband.
Slowly, he regained his strength, fortified by some of his new wife's home cooking.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The fact that he'd survived this long suggested that he built up a tolerance through many small doses over a period of time. In other words, he may have been systematically poisoned. His ordeal wasn't over yet. Further tests showed that his arsenic levels were increasing while he lay in the hospital. Suspecting foul play, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation cleared Reverend Moore's room and posted a guard at the door.
I'm gonna have to ask everyone to leave the room and go down to the waiting room.
The patient was to eat no more food brought from outside the hospital. Investigators had every indication that he was being poisoned by someone he knew, someone he trusted, perhaps even someone in his own family. Their first suspect was his son, a biochemist. He'd have the know-how to do it, but he didn't have the opportunity to administer the poison.
This is with your new stepmom.
While police worked to protect Reverend Moore, the hospital staff worked to cure him. He was treated with a chelating agent, a compound that bonded with the arsenic in his body to flush it out of his system. The treatment was as painful as the poison. Meantime, investigators interviewed him to determine some clue about who might have been poisoning him. As the conversation turned to his family, Moore described his courtship with Blanche. One detail caught the detective's attention. Blanche's previous boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had died of a disease with all the symptoms of a serious stomach flu, symptoms very similar to what the Reverend was suffering from.
Was there anything
Investigators
else about,
began to delve into
about that
Blanche's
that
past.
any interest or
I don't think
anything
so.
suspicious?
No.
Oh, good morning, Blanche. How are you?
She had met her former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, while working in the grocery store he managed.
Last night?
Didn't? No.
They had been together for 15 years when Reed was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a debilitating nerve disease that attacks the spinal cord. It begins as numbness and can progress to paralysis and sometimes death. But another frightening aspect of Guillain-Barré is that it's the most common misdiagnosis for long-term arsenic poisoning. To test that theory, investigators requested Reed's complete medical records. While they waited, they collected a sample of Reverend Moore's hair to see how long he'd been
Need a couple
poisoned.
more if you take and close that one.
Hair can be a very valuable substance for testing in cases of arsenic poisoning because as the hair grows, any arsenic that's present in the blood at that time will get deposited into the roots of the hair.
How you doing?
Like a modern-day Delilah, Blanche thought that by cutting her husband's hair, she'd weaken the state's case against
You're gonna be
her.
the best looking guy in the neighborhood.
But when she brought her brother to the hospital to give Reverend Moore a close trim, she was too late. Investigators had already gathered the sample they needed. When Reverend Moore's hair was tested, it was polluted with arsenic from follicle to tip, meaning he'd been fed a steady diet of the toxin. He'd had 2 large doses 7 and 8 months earlier, in November and December 1988. He'd spent time in the hospital, but the poison went undetected. The same couldn't be said for Raymond Reed. When his medical records arrived, investigators made an alarming discovery. He'd been done in by a clerical error. At one point during his hospitalization, his doctors had ordered a test for heavy metals. But the results were temporarily lost in a blizzard of paperwork. In the interim, Reed died. 3 years later, when detectives were looking into Blanche Moore's past, doctors and police finally saw those results. Raymond Reed had been poisoned. It appeared that Blanche was seasoning her dishes with more than just sugar and spice.